We are in the third and final section. This being our last week, I want to again mention there are three major sections. There is the national, personal, and international section. There is the message to Judah, there's Jeremiah's suffering, and then the message to the nations. Every prophet, nearly every prophet, not exactly every prophet, but nearly every prophet has something to say about the nations. You remember it in the very first chapter, Jeremiah was said to be a prophet to the nations. We've covered all of these 9 nations except for Babylon, and that's where we are in our study tonight. Chapters 50 and 51 deal with Babylon, and then chapter 52 seems like an appendix, and that is, here's the prophet's captivity and the release, as Wiersbe calls it, or I prefer to look at chapter 52 as simply saying that what Jeremiah is saying is my prophecy came true. This is what happened. It happened like I prophesied. And we'll see more about that when we get to chapter 52. Now, you're looking in your handout for this, and that is a summary of these 3 chapters. I like starting with a summary. What is each chapter about? Chapter 50 is about a prophecy against Babylon. Primarily that, and so is chapter 51. So what's chapter 50 about? Prophecy against Babylon. What's 51? Prophecy against Babylon. What's the difference in the chapters? Well, there's the announcement, the shame, and who's going to do this? The Medes. Well, in chapter 51, he still talks about the Medes being the one that's going to bring Babylon down. We see a contrast between God and idols, and then we see the utter doom that is coming upon Babylon. Babylon has been this nation that has been the threat to God's people since Assyria was the threatening nation. And so now this is the nation that is the threat for God's people. Now, chapter 52, we'll come back to 50 and 51, obviously, deals with the capture and the destruction of Jerusalem. That's a better summary than Wiersbe had, I think. But anyway, this deals with the capture and the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what Jeremiah's been prophesying about, and that's what he shows here in this appendix, so to speak. So following the outline that we have with reference to the chapters, we've had the prophecy against Egypt, Philistia, and then Moab, and then there were other smaller nations, 5 smaller nations, and now we're dealing with the prophecy concerning Babylon. Now here's what we grouped chapter 50 and 51 together. But before we get into that, this is where we sometimes kind of lose people with reference to the prophets. And I want to make a couple of notes about this before we go any further. And you're looking for some of this in a moment as I'll put up on the screen. You're looking for some of this on your handout if you're trying to fill that out. But this is where we sometimes lose people, and the attitude sometimes is, can't we just skip and just get the high point maybe and look at a verse or two, and then, because there's just so much. Why are so many verses? Look at chapter 50, there's 46 verses. Chapter 51, there's 64 verses. And so you have all of these verses that deal with Babylon. Why so much? Couldn't it just be said, Babylon is doomed and get it over with? Well, the elders here are operating on this, because we've talked about this numerous times, so I know the other elders agree with this. We're functioning on the principle that if God wrote 100 verses about a subject, even if he repeats himself 50 times in those 100 verses, he intended for us to read those 100 verses, or he wouldn't have written those 100 verses. And so I didn't write chapters 50 and 51. God wrote it, and so if he says the same thing over and over and over, he must have thought we needed to hear it over and over and over and over. And so we're going to do that and not apologize for the repetition throughout. Now, before we go into those points about chapters 50 and 51, let's get the 2 major points and see if we don't see these 2 major points. And you're looking for this in your handout. So when we get through with 50 and 51, what did we see? Let's just assume we're already through with them. Here's what we just saw. We saw Babylon is doomed. And what's interesting about that is Babylon is still the nation in power at the time that the prophecy is being made. And Babylon is carrying the people of God off into captivity. It looks like Babylon is the most powerful. And so here is the prophecy. This nation that I've been prophesying about that's going to take you into captivity is going to fall to another nation. And so we have the prophecy that Babylon is doomed. The second point we're going to see in 50 and 51 is that Judah will return. And I put in parentheses, that's encouragement. The whole thing about Babylon falling serves as an encouragement. You say, what were the Jews to get out of this? Well, what they get out of it was encouragement. It wasn't just, you say, well, this is doom and gloom, and I get kind of weary with doom and gloom. Well, this is encouragement to the Jews. And what I'm learning from that is that you're going to come back, Babylon's going to fall, this should be encouraging to the Jews. And so Jeremiah is also going to prophesy. You're going to return, and did prophesy in 70 years, and that's exactly what takes place. Now let's list 5 lessons that we're going to learn from this. These are 2 major points, but here's some lessons that we've seen or will have seen when we get through with 50 and 51. Let's go through these, and you may want to list these in your handout. The first thing is that God uses nations as tools. So how am I going to benefit from Jeremiah 50 and 51? I'm going to see something we've seen all through Isaiah, and we're going to see it again, and we have seen it again and again and again through Jeremiah. We'll see it in other prophets. God uses nations as tools. God used Assyria. God used Babylon. God's going to use the Medo-Persians. And so consequently, God uses nations as tools, which reminds us of Daniel. God rules in the kingdoms of men. Secondly, we see God has a plan and a purpose that He works. And so we're going to see His purposes are carrying out. In fact, that's the wording of some phrases in Jeremiah 50 and 51. God's working out His purpose. Thirdly, we see wickedness will not go unpunished. So you remember Habakkuk. We haven't got to Habakkuk yet in our studies, and we'll get to him later. But Habakkuk cried out to God, how long? Remember that question? Well, his question was, how long are you going to let Judah go on unpunished? And God said, well, okay, I'm going to deal with them. I'm going to bring Babylon in and punish them. Well, that didn't go well with Habakkuk. That wasn't the right thing for God to do. And so the point I'm learning in Jeremiah is that wickedness does not go unpunished. So God uses this wicked nation, Babylon. But God's going to deal with Babylon. And God will deal with the needs, and God will deal with any nation. All right, here's another lesson we're looking at and we're going to see, and that is our God is powerful and He's gracious. He's a powerful God who can raise Babylon up. He can bring Babylon down. He can raise the Medes up. He can bring them down. And He could raise up Assyria and take it down. He could raise up Judah and bring it down. But He's also a gracious God because there's forgiveness pronounced throughout these chapters. And then finally, and this is a very important lesson, there's evidence of inspiration. If we were doing a study of evidence of inspiration, we would be talking about prophecy and fulfillment at some point in that. That's not the only evidence we could cite, but that's one of the strong evidences we could cite. And one of the evidences we would cite would be the prophecy against Babylon, Isaiah 13, Jeremiah 50 and 51. And so we would point out that God prophesied that it would fall and there would be utter destruction and not be rebuilt. Well, that's exactly what happened. And so we have prophecy and fulfillment. So there is value in Jeremiah 50 and 51. That's what I'm trying to get you to see. So let's watch for these points, and we'll try to call them to our attention as we go through. All right. Now, let's start with chapter 50. Now, we don't have time to deal with every point in every verse. That's not our intent. But let's get a summary of what's going on here. The first thing, point A on the screen before you, we're dealing all of these. Point A through H is a prophecy against Babylon. So here's the announcement of the fall of Babylon and the deliverance of Israel. Those are the 2 points we're looking for. So we see, beginning at verse 1, the word of the Lord spoke against Babylon, against the land of the Chaldeans, by Jeremiah the prophet. So here is the 9th of these nations that he's dealing with. Now, in verse 2, he talks about proclaiming to the nations, and proclaim it and do not conceal it. Say, Babylon is taken. Now, here's the first prophecy. In other words, we can stop at that point. Babylon is falling. Babylon is taken. Notice he mentions 2 gods, Babylonian gods, Baal, which is a form of Baal. This is B-E-L, B-A-A-L, same kind of god. And Merodach is broken to pieces. So here are their gods. Babylon is falling. Well, what about the Babylon gods? They're broken down in their pieces. Her idols are humiliated. Now here's a phrase you're looking for in your handout. Her images are broken in pieces. Now, in a cursory reading of the English, we don't get this. Humphreys points out that her images is a phrase that means dungy things or dung pellets. Now you think about how that insults Babylon. That her images, that is, your gods are nothing but dung pellets. Now that's kind of a put down of your gods, I want to tell you. And which tells me Jeremiah was quite stern in his message to Babylon. Now, verse 3, here's the point. I'm going to try to list several points that are made in these first 10 verses. They're going to fall. So number one, they're going to fall. Secondly, he mentions that they're going to fall to an enemy nation. For out of the north, a nation comes up against her. Now, let's just assume we don't know. We're going to see we know it was the Medes, but he hadn't told us yet. So a nation's going to come from the north, and which will make her land desolate. Now, notice at verse 4 and 5. You're looking for this information, I think. I put this in the handout. You're looking for messages that are messianic in their implication in this chapter. And so there are going to be two. Here's the first at verse 5. But before we get to verse 5, there's going to be an end to their captivity. That's the second of the messages we're looking for. Look at verse 4. In those days and at that time, says the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, and they and the children of Judah together with continual weeping, and they shall come. So that prophesies of a return. But then when he mentions they're going to come seeking the Lord, and they'll ask the way to Zion with their faces toward it, saying, come, let us join ourselves to the Lord. That seems to be messianic. That ultimately it's fulfilled in the Messiah. That's one of two that we want to talk about tonight. Now at verse 6, let's shift gears again. Here's a picture of God's people who are coming back. They are pictured as being a lost sheep. You're looking for two verses tonight where that's the case. They are in the handout. The first is verse 6, and the other we're going to see at verse 17. They're scattered sheep. God pictures his people as being scattered and lost sheep. He's going to gather his sheep back up again. Now at verse 7, Babylon makes a claim of innocence. All who found them devoured them, and their adversaries said, we have not offended. In other words, as Babylon falls, we haven't done anything wrong. What have we done wrong? Is kind of the picture of the Babylonians. Now at verse 8, he mentions, move from the midst of Babylon, go out of the land of the Chaldeans, and be like the rams before the flock. That's a male goat that leads out in the front. And so we got what he's saying to the people of God, when time comes, when Babylon falls, you go out of Babylon. You'll have that opportunity. They can't imagine what's going to happen, that's going to be the case. Now let's finish up this first section by looking at verse 9. For behold, you might underline, I will raise. What's the significance? I will raise and cause to come up against Babylon an assembly of great nations. There's going to be the Medes, with support of others, are going to come up against Babylon. Now, here's what I learned from that. I just saw this point. When I say I just saw it, I don't mean I just saw it just now, but having read that, here's something I just learned from that. What do I learn from that? It's not just a prophecy here that Babylon is going to fall. That would be outstanding if God could stand back and say, Babylon is going to fall, but God has nothing to do with it, but Babylon is going to fall. God prophesied of that. There's more than that. God said, I'm the one that's going to cause them to fall. So I see God's control, God's ruling in the nations there. So Babylon is going to be utterly destroyed. Look at verse 10. And Chaldea shall become plunder. All who plunder her shall be satisfied. All right, so what do we see in verses 1 through 11? Babylon is going to fall. Israel, Judah is going to be delivered. Now let's go to 11 through 20. Point B, the shame of Babylon in contrast to the glory of Israel. Let's see what we see here beginning at verse 11. Now, at verse 11, because you were glad, because you rejoiced, you destroyers of my heritage, because you've grown fat like a heifer threshing grain. What's his point? They're like a heifer eating grain and getting fat off of that. You thrashed on my people. You were glad and you rejoiced when you destroyed my heritage. God tolerated that. God allowed that to punish them. But he said, you're going to be destroyed because of that. Now, notice at verse 13, they're going to be desolate. Because of the wrath of the Lord, she shall not be inhabited. That's part of the prophecy that we'd point to that was fulfilled. They became desolate and never rebuilt as that nation. I don't mean there's no nation there now, but Babylon never recovered. Look at verse 14. We're still talking about the shame. Put yourselves in array against Babylon all around. Here's the reason they fall. Shoot at her, spare no arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. Now, Babylon is a heathen nation, but God still holds them accountable, which tells me that all men are amenable to God and to his law. Now notice at end of verse 15, I know I'm not hitting every phrase, we don't have time for that, but at the end of verse 15, take vengeance on her as she has done, so do to her. In other words, Babylon has been devouring this nation, and then this nation, and this nation, and this nation. Now God's saying to the other nations, y'all go in and devour her like she's been devouring everybody else. It's time for Babylon to get what she's dished out. Fear is going to be on every side. Notice at verse 16, fear of the oppressing sword. I'm reading in the middle of the verse. Verse 17, here is another reference to Israel being a scattered sheep. But now when I come to verse 19, here again is the promise of the return. I will bring back Israel to his habitation, and he shall feed on Carmel and Bashan, and his soul shall be satisfied on Mount Ephraim and Gilead. In those days and at that time, says the Lord. Now here's a second messianic prophecy. God's going to forgive, is the idea. In those days, says the Lord, the iniquity of Israel shall be sought, and there shall be none, and the sins of Judah shall be sought, and they shall not be found. I will pardon those whom I preserve. What's he saying? The time is coming when you look to Judah and to Israel, and you start looking for their sin, and it's all gone. It's a promise of forgiveness. It reminds me of Hebrews 8 and verse 12, Jeremiah 31, verse 34. God will remember their sins and iniquities against them no more. God's forgiving is the idea. Now, let's go to verse 21 now. Let's shift gears. We're at point C. We see the pride and the power of Babylon is broken. Babylon is this powerful, mighty nation. Powerful nation. And God said, I broke, and I'm going to break them all up. Now, go up against the land of Merathan. That literally means double rebellion. You see, Babylon rebelled, but Babylon was full of rebellion. And so perhaps that name is best. And of the inhabitants of Pekod, which means punishment or punishing. So I'm going to, this powerful nation, I'm going to bring down. Now, you want to pay attention to verse 22 and 23 particularly. The sound of the battle of the land and of great destruction. This is what's going to happen to Babylon. But here's verse 23 is what you really want to pay attention to. How the hammer of the whole earth has been cut apart and broken. Babylon was referred to, and I think you're looking for this in your handout. I meant to put this there. That Babylon was referred to as the hammer of all the earth. Up to this point, there's no nation quite as powerful as Babylon. That Babylon was pictured as a hammer that's just beating the whole earth and hammering the whole earth. And if you could picture a gigantic sledgehammer that is being used to beat the nations, now go back to verse 23, the hammer has been cut apart and broken. You say, man, I don't know, if somebody was hitting me with a sledgehammer, I don't think I could do it. But God took that sledgehammer and cut it all to pieces, and it's broken, shattered. That hammer's not going to be swung anymore. That hammer's not going to hit anything anymore. That hammer's done, and that hammer's finished. And so that's an interesting phrase. We're going to look at other nations that are phrased similar to that, and we're going to list those, and you're looking for that a little later in your handout. But anyway, verse 23 is just fascinating me. The hammer of the whole earth shall be cut to pieces. Now, how Babylon has become a desolation among the nations, verse 23. But notice at verse 24, how indeed did you have indeed been trapped, O Babylon, and you are not aware, and you have been found and also caught, because you contended against the Lord. There's two things I want you to see at verse 24. Let's start at the end and work our way back up. They had contended against the Lord. That's their sin. They had fought against God. They were enemies of God. But I'm more interested at this juncture that they were caught and trapped and not aware. The river Euphrates surrounded them and served as their protection. In 539, Cyrus the Mede, I am told, diverted the water into canals and lowered the water level, which allowed entrance into the city. So they were surrounded, and they were trapped, and they were invaded in that process. And so all this protection you thought you had, not going to protect you when God's ready for you to come down. Now let's work our way on down. Now we're still in this section right here. Don't lose our place. We're still talking about the pride and the power 21 to 40. That's a large section, but let's point out some other things. Now notice at verse how devastating it's going to be. At the end of verse 26, and destroy her utterly, let nothing be left in her. Slay all of her bulls. Verse 28, here is encouragement to Israel. The voice of those who fled and escaped from the land of Babylon declare in Zion the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple. In other words, this ought to be encouraging to Israel. Babylon is going to fall. When they hear news of that and they get message, oh, I heard Babylon is falling. That encourages Israel. That encourages Israel. Now notice at verse 29, at the end of verse 29, according to all she has done, do to her, for she has been, you might circle the word, proud against the Lord. We're talking about the pride is what brought her down. We see the pride that brought her down. Look at verse 31. Verse 31, but I am against you, you most proud. Look at verse 32, the most proud shall stumble and fall. Babylon was powerful and proud. Nobody can ever take us down. We're mighty. God said, you're proud and I'm going to bring you down. I'm going to bring you down to the ground. I learned from verse 34, the Redeemer is strong. The Lord can be trusted. The Lord is on our side. The Lord is for us. Now at verse 35, a sword is against the Chaldeans. That's the Babylonians. And notice I'm against her princes, verse 35, and her wise men and her soothsayers and her mighty men and her chariots and her treasuries, verse 37. In other words, there is, what I'm learning from that, there is no help from the mighty men to the warriors to whoever it is that's in power, to the chariots, her treasuries. When Babylon falls, nothing is going to help. But we got money, doesn't matter. We got mighty men, doesn't matter. God's going to bring them down. Now notice at verse 39, here's the utter destruction. It shall be inhabited no more forever. That's part of the prophecy that we've been talking about that shows evidence of inspiration, because just as the prophet said, that's exactly what took place. And had they come back and rebuilt just in a year or two, or 3, 4, or 5 years later, come back and rebuilt and they're a mighty nation again, then the prophecy would have failed. Now notice at verse 41. Now we're starting a new section. At verse 41, the enemy shall be brought against Babylon by the Lord. So just as God had used Babylon as a tool, he's going to use another nation as a tool. God's got many tools in his tool belt. And so he whipped out this tool of Babylon, he used it, and when he was through with that, he destroyed that hammer. And now God's got another tool he's going to use, and that is the Assyrians. So we start at verse 41, a people from the north and a great nation and many kings shall be raised up from the ends of the earth. God's going to raise up another nation to come up against them. Now, this is going to get us down through the end of the chapter. I want you to notice at verse 43, the king of Babylon had heard the report about them, and his hand grew feeble. Here was a man, or the king representing the nation, that was fearless, is now full of fear. Get the picture of a bully that acts like he's not afraid of anybody, and he's fighting everybody, and he's beat everybody he's ever fought. All of a sudden, he comes up against somebody, and this bully now is trembling and is shaking. That's the king of Babylon. That's Babylon. That's what's going on. Now, at verse 44, I'm in the second half of the verse, the question is, who can stand against the Lord? That's the question. We've seen that before. In other words, when the Lord comes against Babylon, Babylon can't stand against the Lord. They're not that powerful. They may be powerful, but not that powerful at all. Now, here's one of the things. Remember we talked about the 5 points, and one of the things that we're looking for is God carrying out his purpose. Here it is right here at verse 45. Therefore hear the counsel of the Lord that he has taken against Babylon, and his purposes that he has purposed against the land of the Chaldeans. God's carrying out his purpose. So God's purpose is he wants to bring it into the Chaldeans. If he doesn't, then Israel's not coming back. He has to do that to fulfill the prophecy of Cyrus the Mede, allowing them to return. Now, that gets us down through verse 45, and we're going to end chapter 50 right there. So we're halfway through this. The enemies are going to be brought against them, and the Medes then are named as the instrument we're going to see in chapter 51. So let's keep rolling into chapter 51. The Medes are named as God's instrument of vengeance. He hasn't named them yet, but we're going to see them right here in chapter 51 in verses 1 to 14. So let's see who this is. Let's see what he says about them. Chapter 51, verse 1. Behold, I will raise up against Babylon. I will send winnowers against Babylon, and they shall win and empty the land. And I'm going to send someone in to reap and take Babylon down. And I'm going to tell them at the end of verse 3, do not spare the young men. Utterly destroy them. Now, notice at verse 4 and 5, the point is made, God has not forsaken his people. In other words, when Babylon is getting strong and taking them into captivity, God maybe has forsaken his people. For 70 years, it may look like God has forsaken his people. The encouragement is, God has not forsaken his people. For Israel is not forsaken, I'm at verse 5, nor Judah by his God. Neither the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom is forsaken by his God, the Lord of hosts, though their land is filled with sin against the Holy One of Israel. Now, there will be some who escape. In other words, there'll be a remnant. Flee from the midst of Babylon. That is, there's going to be a remnant to come back. And that's one of the major points we've been looking for. Now, here we go again. Look at verse 7. Mark this in your Bible. Babylon is a golden cup in the Lord's hand. What does that tell you? All Babylon was a tool. All Babylon was a tool. Now, this is not a gun question, but whether you should have or shouldn't have a gun. But if a criminal came to you and pointed his gun in your face, you'd tremble and you'd be afraid. But suppose he lays that gun down and he goes out and he runs and he's gone away. Are you going to stand in front of the gun just trembling? I'm scared to death what that gun's going to do. No. Because all the gun is a tool in the hand of the criminal. Babylon is just a tool. Babylon was powerful because God allowed that to be done. But when God's through and destroys Babylon, don't fear Babylon anymore. That's part of what I want you to see. But mark verse 7, it's merely an instrument or a tool. Now Babylon is stubborn. Look at verse 9. We would have healed Babylon. She is not healed. Forsake her and let her go. Verse 9 and 10, I'm just going to summarize that there's a multitude of sins. But now drop down to verse 11 and you might circle for future study that God is going to raise the spirit of the king of the Medes. There is the tool God's about to use. God raised up Assyria. God raised up Babylon. God's raising up the Medes, later joined with the Persians, and thus we talk about the Medo-Persian Empire. Circle that word Medes there. Now let's talk about what's going to take place. Look at verse 13. This is because your end has come, the measure of your covetousness. Here's the measure of your covetousness, their sin. Now notice at the end of verse 14, before we leave that section, the Lord of hosts has sworn by himself, surely I will fill you with men as with locusts. There are going to be many against you. Can you imagine being invaded by locusts? How many are there? There's too many to count. God says, I'm going to invade you with men like invading you with locusts. That is, he's talking to Babylon, what's going to take place with them. All right, now let's shift gears. Let's shift gears. We're ready for point F. The omnipotence of God in contrast to the nothingness of their idols. Babylon had idols. They're not going to help at all. But our God is a powerful God. Remember that point we were learning? Our God's a powerful God. Now, let's look at verse 15. He made the earth by his power. He established the world by his wisdom. He stretched out the heavens by his understanding. When he utters his voice, the multitude of waters in the heavens. He calls the vapors to ascend in the earth, from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasure. See what God's done? God's created the world, created lightning. He's created nature. Look what God did, how powerful he is. Everyone, verse 17, is dull-hearted without knowledge, every metalsmith. In other words, those that make idols are dumb. And they don't have knowledge. And every metalsmith is put to shame by the carved image that he molded because there's no breath in them. So the idol maker makes his idol and he said, here's the idol I just made. And you ask him, is it alive? No, it isn't alive. I made a God, but he's not alive. There's no breath in him. In the time of their punishment, they'll perish. In other words, this God don't do any good, so when the Babylon is invaded, that God has no power compared to our God. The portion of Jacob is not like them. That's a reference to God, is not like them, for he is the maker of all things. The Lord of hosts is his name. Now then, verse 20, you're looking for this in your handout. Look at verse 20. You are my battle axe and weapon of war. He's talking about the Medes that we referenced over in verse 11, and we'll see Babylon in contrast at verse 24. Now let's stop and footnote just a little bit. Assyria was called the rod of God's anger in Isaiah 50, verses 3 to 5. Assyria was a tool of God, the rod of his anger. Babylon was called the hammer of the earth in chapter 50, verse 23. And now the Medes are called God's battle axe. That's interesting. God said, I had a tool I used for a while called Assyria. Had another tool called Babylon. And I've got another tool now I'm bringing out. I'm going to use my battle axe. And that's the Medes. I'm going to use them. For with you, here's your tool. With you I will break the nations in pieces, and with you I will destroy kingdoms. With you I will break in pieces the horse and the rider, and I will break in pieces the chariot and its rider. Notice God saying what I will do. Not that you will do it, but I will do it through you. God's using them as a tool. Now look at verse 24. I will repay Babylon and all the inhabitants of Chaldea for all the evil they have done in Zion in your sight. Now here's an interesting point. God used Babylon and allowed Babylon to invade Judah, to punish Judah. But God did not approve of the evil that they did against Judah. God allowed it. God allowed evil men to crucify his son, but God didn't cause it. They were still sinful in their action. Think about that parallel. But you might notice at verse 24, I will repay Babylon. Now let's start at verse 25 now and go through verse 58, the doom of Babylon. You say, well, I thought that's what this whole thing was about. Well, it is. But he focuses on the doom of Babylon. We're going to see the Medes again. Behold, I'm against you, O destroying mountain, who destroyed all the earth. And I will stretch out my hand against you and roll you down from the rocks and make you a burnt mountain. In other words, by taking down Babylon, it's like taking down a mountain, a mighty mountain. Can you imagine a mighty mountain? You'd say, boy, the work it would take to take it down, God said, I can take it down, and I'm going to take this big mountain down. I'm going to disassemble it rock by rock, and it's going to crumble, it's going to fall. And God's taking down the mountain. Now let's drop down to verse 28 now. Prepare against her the nations with the king of the, here you might circle again, the Medes. Here is the tool. Now again, if God had prophesied Babylon is going to fall in 70 years, but he never tells us who, that's a mighty prophecy. But God tells us how many years it's going to be. First of all, the nation's going to fall. Tells us how many years it's going to be, and then he tells us the nation that's going to bring that about, the Medes. Now that is fascinating prophecy. So I see who. Now, again, I see God working out his purpose, verse 29. Remember, that was one of the 5 points we were looking for or learning? Verse 29, and the land will tremble and sorrow, for every purpose of the Lord shall be performed against Babylon. If God's purpose is to bring her down, it's going to be brought down. That's going to happen. Now, we see how terrible it is. Look at verse 30. Mighty men of Babylon have ceased fighting. Those who they have remained in their strongholds. Their might has failed. They became like women. There's two or three times that statement is made. The mighty men became like women. That's not a put down of women. What it's saying is women. It's actually a extolling of women. They are delicate. They are the weaker vessel. That's God's description. And so the mighty men became weaker, and they became like delicate people. And that's not what you want in a fighting army. And so consequently, their mighty men have become like women. And they have burned their dwelling places. The bars of her gates are broken. It's it's a terrible destruction coming up on Babylon. Look at verse 32, the end of verse 32. The men of war are terrified. Can you imagine soldiers that talk about being so mighty? They're shaking and they're trembling. That's how bad Babylon is going to fall. Now, let's go to verse 34. Here is the cry of Jerusalem. You say, how do you know this is the cry of Jerusalem? When it says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, he has devoured me. Because verse 35 says that's what Jerusalem said. That's how I know. But anyway, this seems to be the cry of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is crying out. What does Jerusalem say? Well, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, devoured me and he crushed me and he's made me empty, an empty vessel. He came in and just turned us upside down and emptied us out. And he swallowed us like a monster and he filled his stomach with our delicacies. And he has spit us out and he let violence be done. Let the violence be done to me, upon my flesh be upon Babylon. So the cry of Jerusalem was, Babylon's king came in and destroyed us. Let him be destroyed of his nation. And God's saying, that is exactly what's going to happen. Look at verse 30. Verse 36, here was God's answer to the plea of Jerusalem. Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, I plead your case and take vengeance for you. I will dry up her sea and make her a spring dry. Babylon has become a heap. In other words, here's the picture of Jerusalem crying out, do to Babylon what's been done to us, please. And God said, I hear you. I got you. I'll take care of that, and I'm going to see that it's done. And notice verse 37, Babylon will become a heap and is going to be destroyed. Now, at verse 41, how shall Shishak, that's code word, your footnote will say for Babylon, how Babylon is taken. How the praise of the whole earth is seized. Babylon is pictured as the one that's praised as the mighty nation, been taken down. The sea has come over Babylon, verse 42. Drop down to end of verse 44. Verse 44, I will punish Baal in Babylon. That's her God. And at the end of verse 44, the wall of Babylon shall fall. Now we're going to shift gears again. Not in a break in verses. We're still talking about the doom of Babylon. Babylon's going to fall. That's one of the two major things we're seeing. Here was the second one, the deliverance of Judah. Look at verse 45. My people shall go out in the midst of her. When Babylon falls, they're going to come back. A remnant's coming back into the land. My people shall go out of the midst of her. Let everyone deliver himself from the fierce anger of the Lord. That is, this captivity you're going to is the fierce anger of the Lord. You're going to be delivered. Therefore the days are coming that I'll bring my judgment upon the carved images. I'm reading verse 47 of Babylon. Now let's jump over to verse 51 now and finish down through verse 58. And let's see if we can finish this. That in this section we have the picture of shame when Israel comes back. They are ashamed. I just want to hit a couple of high points because I want to get to 52. Our time's running out. That we are ashamed because we have heard reproach. Shame has covered our faces. That is when the remnant comes back. They come back in shame for their sin. Now drop down to verse 56. For the Lord is the God of recompense. He will surely repay. Babylon is going to be in perpetual sleep. And look at into verse 58. They labor in vain. That is, any effort to fight against God and the Medes is going to be utterly useless. Now, the last section of 51, before we leave that, is Jeremiah commands Seraiah and gives him a command. What is the command? You're looking for this in your handout. And that is, he told him, by the way, he was a cabinet member that was in charge of the traveler's food, a brother to Baruch that we mentioned in chapter 32. Anyway, Jeremiah wrote down the prophecy, and he's told to read the prophecy against Babylon. And when you get over to Babylon, you read it and then tie a rock to that and throw it into the Euphrates, and that symbolizes the fall and the sinking of Babylon. That's all that section's about, a symbolic gesture of the fall of Babylon. Well, that's 50 and 51 now. There is a lot to get through. That we lose people sometimes in the midst of that, and hopefully you saw these lessons in these two major points. Now let's go to this section that we call the appendix. It's a suddenly shifting of gears. It's not flowing out of 51 and the next thing just flows right into that. This seems to be an appendix. What's the point of 52? The point of 52 seems to demonstrate Jeremiah's prophecy was fulfilled in contrast to the false prophets. So after the book is recorded, this seems to be kind of an appendix, an addendum, a postscript that says, by the way, this prophecy of the fall of Babylon, the fall of Judah happened, just like Jeremiah said, and they went into captivity, just like Jeremiah said. In other words, Jeremiah is saying, I was right. I was right. God was right, really, is the point to be made. Now, let's see what we can do with this. Here we have the fate of Zedekiah, the last king. Now, time is about gone, so I'm going to quickly go to 52. 52 is an interesting chapter, but it's rehashing things we've already seen. So I'm just going to quickly notice this. We'll cheat a little bit, Gary. Hopefully you'll cheat on time for us just a little bit so we can get through this. By the way, chapter 39 is parallel to this. But what we have here, first of all, is the fate of Zedekiah. You remember his eyes were put out, and then he went off to prison. Well, that's what is said at verse 10 and 11. The city is broken down at verse 7. I'm kind of going backwards in this section. But verse 7 talks about the city walls being broken down. But verse 4 says the last siege lasted 18 months, a year and a half. All right, let's start at verse 12 now. Jerusalem and the temple is destroyed. When Nebuchadnezzar comes in for the third invasion, the temple is destroyed, verse 13. So the temple is utterly destroyed. The walls of the city, verse 14, are taken down. People are taken captive. And only the poorest of the poor are left behind. They took the bronze pillars. That's the two pillars at the temple. They were taken. And there's already been vessels taken out of Jerusalem. This is kind of the cleaning up and taking the rest of them to Babylon. Now, the last section here, or near the last section, the third section rather, the people are taken captive. Two things happen here. The chief officers are arrested and they're killed. But then, here's the number of captives that were taken to Babylon. So here is the controversy. I wish we had more time to deal with this. Those that are listed here are listed in the first invasion, 597, as... the 597 number is 3,023, and 823 in 586, and in 581 later, 745. All right? Those numbers don't agree with 2 Kings 24 and 25. And so what is that? How does that harmonize? Well, I don't have time to go into that. I had a quote or two I wanted to share with you. I don't have time to share all that. It seems that these, as one writer says, I believe it was Kaiser made the point, this section is not included in 2 Kings 25, and the author adds it here to show that there were other exile groups taken to Babylon. And that the point being made here is that this is a secondary number in addition to what we may see elsewhere. This may include, some think maybe this includes males only, and it's not a complete number. Perhaps the soldiers were not included as they were excluded or taken out of the number in 2 Kings chapter 24. All I'm trying to get you to see is there are various explanations that make sense of trying to harmonize, and do they even need to be harmonized? Because it may be seeing a number here, and then this is an additional in the final invasion of numbers who were taken captive. And then the last thing there we have, Jehoiakim is released and restored to royal favor. He's been in prison, he's brought out, and he's given royal favor to the day that he died. And that's how the book ends. And that's it. That's Jeremiah. Now, Lamentation follows, also written by Jeremiah, and that's what we're going to cover next time. So we'll stop at that. We'll start into Lamentations chapters 1 and 2 next time.